Hey, Mike. Well, we got something new here, sponsorship with probably our favorite software, and according to a recent survey, 30% of evangelical churchgoers want more in-depth teaching like we do here at the Naked Bible Podcast. And if you want to go deeper, and there's nothing better than we trust than Logos, it's the Bible study platform, period.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Logos, having worked there a long time, I know Logos fuses powerful technology with biblical resources. You can access Bibles and search tools, commentaries, seminary-level courses now with mobile ed, and even audiobooks right on your phone, tablet, or desktop.
Yeah, and they have over 200,000 digital books. It's crazy. I mean, the power, the technology, the search, and all the cross-references. I honestly don't know how you could go to the depth that you can get studying the Bible if you don't use Logos software.
Well, I think that's the point. You can't. There's no other platform like it. I can remember when I worked there when we crossed 100,000 resources, but now it's double, since I've even been there. So what the difference is that Logos editions of books have been turbocharged with powerful data that connect them with the rest of your library. So everything in the library is completely interconnected. This is not like an ebook or a Kindle book or a PDF or anything like that. It's so far beyond that people don't really realize it until they've actually gotten into it. So whether you're comparing Bible translations or tackling tough topics, studying deep theological issues, Logos is going to have you covered no matter what. And then that's before you even get to original language resources. And one of the crucial tools in Logos are the reverse interlinears, where you don't even have to know Greek and Hebrew to run searches in Greek and Hebrew, tap into the original languages. And Logos will even help you pronounce the words.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, if you're preparing a sermon or a Bible study, I don't know how you don't use Logos to get your study done.
Yeah, I use it literally. I use it every day. I use it hours every day. No exaggeration. I use Logos every day. I'm very familiar with it. I mean, people know that. And there's just nothing like it on the planet.
I mean, if you're serious about Bible study, there's no other software tool out there that will get you as deeper than Logos.
Yep, and I'm asked all the time in email about Bible study tools. And, having been on the podcast for all these years, how many times have you heard me say you need to invest in resources? If you're serious about Bible study, you must invest in resources and tools. And this is it. And I get asked all the time, this question, my answer is always the same. You need to get Logos. And, people sometimes balk at, the affordability question because Logos packages, there's so much in them and they can be expensive. But now Logos is more than affordable. You can get started for just $49. And that's always what I tell people. Get into the platform low and then spend extra money on the books and resources that you want. And now is the perfect time to do that. Just $49.
Yes, and if you want to support the Naked Bible Podcast and what we do here, please go get the Logos software now at logos.com/nakedbible. For $49, get started. And like Mike said, you can build up your library over time, but there's no better time than now to support our show and Logos by going to logos.com/nakedbible. For $49, you can get started right now, Mike. So we encourage all of our listeners, go do it, and you'll be thankful that you did.
Yep, absolutely.
You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 435, the Epistle of Jude, part 4. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike. How you doing?
Oh, doing pretty good. By now, people have gotten the update on my health. So as I was referring to it in the update, it's a glass half full update. So, we're still taking one day at a time, obviously, but I think things are still trending in a good direction.
Yeah. Would you mind giving a brief summary for their listeners who haven't seen that update?
Sure. Yeah, we got results of my third MRI back. The short version is that my cancer is not metastatic. It hasn't spread anywhere, which is the real good news. The bad news is that the size of the tumor is still the same as essentially when we started all this. We're about 10 months. We're a little shy of a year into chemo, and so the chemo has not had the desired effect to shrink the tumor for removal. But the surgeon thought he suspects. He told us at our meeting this last week that he suspects that the tumor might be as much as 50% dead anyway. Size-wise, it is what it is. But it'd be very unusual to have a situation where the chemotherapy has had no effect at all as far as the living and dead tissue and all that sort of stuff. So it basically has prepped talk of radiation to get what they refer to as shrinkage on the outer edges. Basically whatever they can do to make it a little bit smaller, and then we can start talking about possible removal. So it's still trending the way we would want it to trend.
All right. We'll keep our prayers going. Don't let off on that.
Yeah.
And,
I also managed to gain 5 pounds in the last month, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for me, that's really significant.
Yeah,
so, prayers that I still don't have much of an appetite impulse, an eating impulse, but, we have a routine down, so it's helped. And this maintaining weight is important. If I can gain a few more pounds, that would be nice too, but that was a pleasant surprise.
I suggest peanut butter and ice cream. Mike, have you tried that combo? Do you like peanut butter ice cream?
I have not tried that combo. So once in a while I'll eat peanut butter crackers, but I know ice cream, I'm a vanilla guy and we've had plenty of that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, my granddad
that's pretty calorie dense.
Yeah. My grandparents used to mix peanut butter with ice cream. So I grew up with that combo, and
man,
let me tell you, that'll put the weight on you.
Yeah, that's calorie dense right there.
Yeah. Good stuff.
As opposed to just peanut butter ice cream, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. You get a big scoop of it and you mix it together. Oh my gosh. So good. Well, that's good news. I guess no news is good news, and we'll keep plugging away in our prayers and wishing the best. So, but
so like I said, as long as it's moving a little bit in the right direction, we'll take it.
Well, switching gears here, Jude, it's been a great book study, and we're just basically still getting into the beginning of it. So I can imagine today is going to be just as good as the others.
Yeah, today we're going to focus on Jude 7, and we'll hit verses 7 and 8, but Jude 7 is the primary focus. We got into verse 8 a little bit last time when we talked about verse 6, so that'll be part of the picture here anyway, but it's primarily Jude 7. So to jump in here, I'm going to read Jude 5 through 8. I think it gives a little bit of a fuller context for what we'll be talking about here in verse 7. So beginning in verse 5, we read, "Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah," this is verse 7, "just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Yet in like manner these people also, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones." So that's Jude 5 through 8. And again, like I mentioned a moment ago, Jude 7, 7 and 8, but mostly verse 7 is going to be our focus today. We got into verse 8 last time because the verse explains, or at least reiterates, Jude's rationale for comparing the false teachers he's shooting at with typological or archetypal Old Testament sins and sinners. The last time it was the angels that sinned in the days before the flood, and this time in verse 7, it's Sodom and Gomorrah. And as verse 8 suggests, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah had something to do with, again, these three elements: the defiling of the flesh, which is language for sexual sin, rejecting authority, and then thirdly, blaspheming God and his host. Now, the first of these is what we always think of when we think of Sodom and Gomorrah, but I want to tie that episode into the other parts of Jude 8 as well. And I think Gene Green does a really nice job of this in his commentary, again, taking verse 7 with verse 8. So again, just to read verse 7 again, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. And then you get these three elements in verse 8: defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones. So Green, in his commentary, writes this. He says, Jude's third sin by divine judgment is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. God revealed to Abraham his forthcoming judgment on these cities, saying, quote, "How great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how very grave their sin," unquote. That's the NRSV for Genesis 18:20. Somewhat surprisingly, the exact nature of the city's sin is not elaborated. The reader is only made aware of the depravity of the inhabitants of Sodom when the angelic visitors arrive at Lot's house. These soon become the objects of sexual desire by all the male inhabitants of the city, from the youngest to the oldest. Quote, "Bring them out to us so that we may know them," unquote. Genesis 19:5, again NRSV. Lot had shown the messenger's hospitality and tried to protect his guests by taking the extreme measure of offering the assailants his daughters instead, Genesis 19:8. Since not even 10 righteous people were found in Sodom, which again was the barter discussion in Genesis 18, verses 22 through 33. Since you couldn't even find 10 righteous people in the city, God destroyed the city by sulfur and fire, along with Gomorrah, Genesis 19:12 through 29. Included in the judgment were the surrounding cities of the plain. That's Genesis 19:24 through 25 and 28 and 29, which is a piece of the story to which Jude refers in the opening of verse 7. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah became archetypal in the Old Testament as well as in Jewish and Christian literature. Then Green gives a whole grocery list of passages for this: Deuteronomy 32:32, Isaiah 1:10, Isaiah 3:9, Matthew 11:23, in the Septuagint, 3rd Maccabees 2:5, 2nd Esdras or 4th Ezra 7:106. Again, just a number of these passages where Sodom and Gomorrah were archetypal sin episodes. Then Green says, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah became archetypal, as did the divine judgment that came on these cities. And again, a whole grocery list of references there. I won't read them all to you. They were therefore set forward as an example to later generations, unquote. And that's the end of the Green quote. So what was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? I mean, that's the first most obvious question. And as I said above, and as Green suggested, when we think of Sodom and Gomorrah, that sin, we think of the sexual sin specifically. We think of homosexuality, because it's the men of Sodom who want Lot to let them, quote unquote, know the two men in Genesis 19:5, which the reader, of course, knows are angels. You know, it's not that the men of Sodom know this, and Lot doesn't even know it yet, but the readers certainly do. But so since it's the men of Sodom that want to, quote unquote, know the two men there, that we automatically think of the sin of homosexuality. Now, you know, we know that this wording, to come out, you know, bring them out so that we may know them. We know this is sexual for two reasons. First, to know someone, K-N-O-W, is a Hebrew idiom used elsewhere for sexual relations. For instance, in Genesis 4, verse 1, you know, Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived. And this is it's the birth episode of Cain and Abel. And this knowing language is used in Genesis 4, verse 1, verse 17, verse 25. It's very clear We get the same thing in 1 Samuel 1:19 with the case of Hannah and her husband. Again, the same kind of language there. Ezekiel 19:7 is a little more off the beaten path, and a lot of English translations obscure the verse there. But if I could read Ezekiel 19:7 to you, you'll get the flavor here. At least I'll help fill in the gaps here. This is ESV, and I'm going to back it up to let's go to Ezekiel 19. There's a bunch of things happening to the city. Verse 6, he prowled among the lions. He became a young lion. He learned to catch prey. He devoured men, seized their widows. Verse 7, he seized their widows. Again, he here is this in chapter 19, this is a lamentation for the princes of Israel, and basically they become representative of bad behavior. And this line in verse 7 about seizing their widows, he laid waste their cities. Well, the word seized there is actually yada, is actually to know. So he knew their widows. So basically, it's the language of rape. It's the language of ravishing women in conquest. So again, it's in Ezekiel 19, in the context, it's very clear what's being talked about, even though the English translations tend to obscure it with language like ravished or took or something like that. No is what it has in the Hebrew text, just like in Genesis 4, just like in 1 Samuel 1:19. That's the first reason we know that this is sexual, just the idiomatic language. The second is the immediate context. Lot's daughters, again, you get the same language about them. So if we go to Genesis 19 verse 7, this is when the men of Sodom, let's go back up to verse 5. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." So there's the sexual language there. Lot went out to the men at the entrance and shut the door after him and said, this is verse 7, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and you do to them as you please." So right there, we get the same context with Lot offering his daughters sexually to the men of Sodom. And he says, look, they're virgins. They haven't known a man. And it has to mean that they're virgins because it's just not possible. It means that they'd never met a man or never seen a man before. I mean, their dad was a man, okay? So again, the sexual idiomatic language is pretty plain in the passage as it is elsewhere. So we can be sure that the language here and the violation, the potential violation here, is sexual. These men want these 2 visitors, these 2 male visitors, 2 men, as far as they know, that Lot is harboring. They want Lot to bring them out, and they can have their way with them sexually. Since the angels appeared as men and were thought to be men by the male inhabitants of Sodom who wanted to, quote unquote, know them, it's obvious that homosexual relations were part of the story. But was homosexuality per se the sin? Is this proof that all, you could ask it this way, is this proof that all the men of the city, were gay or were homosexuals, practicing homosexuals? And that's very unlikely. It had to do more with the homosexual rape of the 2 men Lot was harboring and the ensuing humiliation upon Lot in the shame-honor culture that required hospitality to strangers in the extreme. I mean, so extreme that Lot is willing to surrender up his daughters to be able to maintain hospitality to strangers. Again, it's a Middle Eastern cultural thing that we're just not familiar with. But again, back in the biblical day, and even to some extent now, hospitality was put very high on the cultural ladder as far as things that you do and don't do. But again, since everybody concerned in the story is male, it's very obvious that homosexual activity is in view. But that doesn't mean that every person in the city, every male of the city was a practicing homosexual or something like that. In this culture and in others, this kind of abuse this kind of rape scenario would have been sort of a gesture of contempt and humiliation. Then none of this undoes the fact that Scripture elsewhere refers to voluntary homosexual behavior as sin. For instance, Leviticus 18:22, Leviticus 20:13, verses like that. But it does, I think, honor the context more that this is really about a violation of hospitality, and in the most visceral sort of way. So all that to say this: there's an obvious defile the flesh element here that would coincide with verse 8. It's nigh unto impossible, again, to deny that and the homosexual nature of it, as far as the actual activity. But as far as the bigger picture, again, I think we need to keep the bigger picture in mind. As a sidebar, for those of you who are interested, I occasionally get the question in email about, hey, what's a good resource on the Bible and what the Bible teaches about homosexuality, and something that's current to kind of keep up with the hermeneutic gymnastics that are have sort of evolved around this topic. And I think the best book here is Robert. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the last name correctly or not. It's either Gagnon, that's Gagnon, or Gagnon, probably Gagnon. Robert Gagnon's book, The Bible and Homosexual Practice, the subtitle is Texts and Hermeneutics. It's a 2002 book, so it's been out for 20 years. But it's very, very thorough and very, current, at least it was for its time. And frankly, there isn't a whole lot more that could be said than the arguments that Gagnon interacts with as far as different approaches to homosexuality and homosexual behavior in the Bible, in both Testaments, and also, of course, in Second Temple Jewish literature and rabbinic literature. It's the most thorough resource that I'm familiar with. So if you're interested in this topic, I'd recommend reading that. It's a pretty substantial book. It's pretty thick. So there you go. So the question is, is there more to it than this? I think, again, we need to look at the wider context as being one of hospitality, but not ignoring, again, the threat of homosexual rape that is obviously lurking in the text. Now, some scholars note that the reader, again, knows that the two men are actually angels, and that should matter. And so they would argue that violation, a violation with angels, is actually the focus of Genesis 19. And if it's the focus of Genesis 19, it would be the focus here of Jude 7. They see, again, these other scholars see a reiteration of the sin of Genesis 6, which is part of the logic not only of the inclusion of Sodom and Gomorrah here in Jude 7. I mean, it comes right on the heel of his example of the archetypal sin of the angels, and then he goes to Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, that, in effect, you have another sin of the angels, or with the angels here. Even though in this case the angels are the victims or the potential victims. They see a reiteration of what's going on with the sin of Genesis 6 here in Jude 7. But also, if you look at it that way, the remaining two elements of verse 8, the rejecting authority and blaspheming God and his host, the glorious ones, that also comes into better focus if you take the sin of Genesis 19 and here of Jude 7 as being more pronounced, not just general, homosexual violation here, but specifically having to do with this transgression of the boundary between the human world and the angelic world. Recall from our earlier episode on Jude 6, part 3 of our Jude exposition series here, that the angelic sin, that a number of commentators, as well as me, see the glorious ones as heavenly beings. Again, I think that's pretty obvious. We cited Gene Green back in that other earlier episode where he notes that in the Septuagint of Exodus 15:11, who is like you among the gods, among the Elim, O Lord, Yahweh. Elim there is translated as glorious ones, the glories. I don't think that's coincidental. I mean, this is vocabulary you would use for supernatural beings, not just not just human beings of high estate or something like that we talked about in the last episode. Bauckham was another one that we quoted last time. Also noted that certain Dead Sea Scrolls call the heavenly beings the glorious ones. And so I think I'm gonna go back to Green's commentary. I think it's worth citing again because he's tracking on the importance of knowing that the audience, the reader, the reading audience knows that the two men in Genesis 19 are angels, and that's a meaningful element in our interpretation here. So Green's commentary I think is worth citing again here. For he ties the elements together. I think a bit in relation to Jude 7 again. So I think he ties verses 7 and 8 together in a fairly succinct way. He writes this. He said, Jude's use of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah underscores these cities' failure way, highlighting they had departed from the order of, and cites the line in the same way as these, in the same way as the violating angels of Jude 6. In the same way as these cities, having indulged in unfaithful acts and gone after another kind of flesh. Again, the men of the city of Sodom are in what Green is arguing is that the men in the city of Sodom are going after angelic flesh, and that's really what Jude's going after, and that's really what Genesis 19 has in view. So back to Green, he writes, Jude links the sin of the angels in verse 6 with that of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, the names of the cities standing for their inhabitants, noting that those people sinned, and here's some Greek, ton homoion tropon tutois, which means in like manner as these angels. So to break in here again, Green is saying that the Greek text itself ties these two things together by using a phrase like in like manner. And then Green says, Jude employs ton homoion tropon, again, some of that Greek phrase again. He employs it adverbially, and then he cites BDF, the Blastebrunner-Frank Greek reference grammar, using an expression that means the same as homotropos, in the same manner. He cites the LSJ lexicon for that. As the angels abandoned their proper station, in verse 6, so too the inhabitants of Sodom, Gomorrah, and the surrounding cities, quote, indulged in unfaithful acts, unquote, which is the English rendering of the aorist participle ek pornousasai. There you get that pornuo, that sexual element there in the Greek verb. So they indulged in unfaithful acts. This verb is found only here in the New Testament, but appears some 41 times in the Septuagint, where it may mean either to indulge in sexual relations, for instance, Genesis 38:24, Leviticus 19:29, Hosea 2:7, Hosea 4:13, or to indulge in acts of unfaithfulness generally with respect to God, Exodus 34:15, Deuteronomy 31:16, Ezekiel 20:30, Hosea 1:2, and there are a few more, but you get the idea. So what Green is saying here is that this term means to either indulge in sexual relations or to, again, more generally engage in acts of unfaithfulness toward God. And you can see how he's linking this all now with verse 8. Both the sin of the angels, Green writes in verse 6, and that of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah had a sexual component, yet Jude's principal emphasis in verse 6 is on the way the angels abandoned their proper place. This the angels, the watchers, did according to the tradition, by engaging in sexual relations with humans. And he cites 1 Enoch 12:4 there. The opposite was true of the Sodomites, who left their place and tried to engage in sexual relations with angelic messengers. While Jude notes the sexual component of the sin, he highlights the way such sin is a violation of the order of things. The angels, quote, did not keep, unquote, but, quote unquote, deserted. And so also the people of Sodom and Gomorrah indulged in unfaithful acts with respect to God. In the further reflection on the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, Jude shines the spotlight on the attempt to engage in sexual acts with angelic messengers by citing the phrase, having gone after another kind of flesh, quote unquote. The flesh of the angelic messengers is here called strange in the King James, in the sense of being of a different kind. And he cites the Bauer, Donker, Arndt, and Gingrich lexicon for that meaning of heteros. Once again, the emphasis falls not simply on the sexual nature of the sin, but also on the way their act contravened the established order of things. Jude's thought in verses 6 and 7 is much akin to that found in the Testament of Naphtali, chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. Now, this is a Second Temple Jewish pseudepigraphal book, and here's the line in that work, quote, "So that you do not become like Sodom, which departed from the order of nature. Likewise, the watchers departed from nature's order," unquote. So the Testament of Naphtali very clearly views as what's happening in Sodom and Gomorrah as a violation of the greater order of things, specifically this transgressing this boundary between the angelic world and the human world. And Green finishes up by saying the sexual aspect of their sin is the vehicle by which they had violated the order established by God. The heretics' sin likewise revolves around a rebellion against established order, with their sexual sin being a function of the fundamental problem. That's the end of Green's quote. Now Bauckham takes the same approach. And I'm citing Green and Bauckham because these are two major commentaries on the book of Jude. So again, we want to reinforce as many times as we can on this podcast that the kind of stuff that Mike is into, that I'm into, and that I write about in Unseen Realm, it's not idiosyncratic to me. Okay, I'm just giving you peer-reviewed, high scholarship on these things that you can find in lots of places and trying to make it decipherable for you. So Bauckham, again, in his Word Biblical Commentary, he takes the same approach that Green does. And he adds a relevant observation about the propensity to see homosexuality as the main focus of Sodom and Gomorrah and the sin there. So Bauckham notes this. He says, these cities, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, had long been regarded as the paradigm case of divine judgment. And he cites Deuteronomy 29:23, Isaiah 1:9, Isaiah 13:19, Jeremiah 23:14, Jeremiah 49:18, Jeremiah 50:40. That's about halfway through his list. Again, references in Maccabees, references in Jubilees, Jubilees 16, Jubilees 20, Jubilees 22. There's a whole bunch of biblical and then, Second Temple Jewish literary texts that make this point that Sodom and Gomorrah and these cities had been regarded as the paradigm case of divine judgment. Bauckham writes on the clauses, quote, which practiced immorality in the same way as the angels and hankered after strange flesh, unquote. So he quotes Jude 7. On those clauses, Bauckham writes, quote, the second clause explains the first. As the angels fell because of their lust for women, so the Sodomites desired sexual relations with angels. The reference is to the incident in Genesis 19:4 through 11. The Greek phrase sarkos heteros, strange flesh. Now catch this. Catch what Bauckham says here. Sarkos heteros, strange flesh, cannot, as many commentators and most translations assume, refer to homosexual practice, in which the flesh is not different, heteros. It must mean the flesh of angels. Now, let me break in here. What his point here is that homosexuality is sex with the same flesh, not different flesh. And again, if you think about it from that perspective, it's like, well, yeah, that it would if it was a same-sex violation. I mean, if that was the point, just the general sin of homosexuality, if that was the point of Genesis 19 that we're supposed to come away with, why would Jude call it strange flesh? Why wouldn't he call it the same flesh? Because that's what a homosexual relationship is. It's a sexual relationship between the same sex. So I think Bauckham's observation here is really is worth pointing out and worth making. And he makes it part of his argument, again, that what Genesis 19 is really, what wants readers to really be horrified over is not, in the immediate context, what would have been ostensibly a homosexual rape situation, but rather that it's this violation of the nature of things, of the order of things, the proper order between heaven and earth, between the seen and the unseen realm, that this is what is more horrific in the Genesis 19 incident, and this is why Jude references it right after referencing the Genesis 6 sin with the angels. And I think this has some explanatory power that we want to be sure we don't miss as we're going through the passage. Bauckham continues, he says, the sin of the Sodomites, not strictly of the other towns, reached its zenith in the most extravagant of sexual aberrations, which would have transgressed the order of creation as shockingly as the fallen angels did. The two cases are similarly brought together in, and he's going to quote, which we just quoted, the Testament of Naphtali 3, verses 4 through 5, which, again, to read that again, the verse says, so that you do not become like Sodom, which departed from the order of nature. Likewise, the watchers departed from nature's order, unquote. So Bauckham, again, is right on track with this. You know, he takes the same perspective. And let me just finish up with him one more statement he makes. He says, in rejecting the commandments of God, you know, this divine order, the false teachers were rebelling against the divinely established order of things as flagrantly as the watchers and the Sodomites had done. Moreover, in doing so, they were motivated, like the watchers and the Sodomites, by sexual lust, and like the Sodomites, insulted angels. And he's looping Jude 8, you know, into the discussion with Jude 7. So all of this, again, is from the reader's perspective. We don't want to miss this as we wrap up here. All of this is from the reader's perspective, what Jude's readers are actually going to be thinking, because they know the Sodom story. They know the whole story back in Genesis 19. They knew that the two men there in Genesis 19 were actually angels. There's no indication, again, the men of Sodom knew that, but the readers of the story do know that. And so Jude is highlighting the way things were in the moment to portray the false teachers, again, as analogous to transgression of divine order. And it's an effective way to look at verse 7 because of the way it ties into verse 8. And I think this is a good place for us to end here, because we get a clear break from the situation with Sodom and Gomorrah to the very next, what we'll cover next time, the very next thing in Jude 9. Let's just go there as by way of a preview. You know, we leave off in verse 8, these people, these false teachers, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, blaspheme the glorious ones. And then here's what we'll cover next time, verses 9 and 10. But when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing about the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, the Lord rebuke you. But these people, again, these false teachers, blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they're destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. So next time we'll hit the whole matter of Moses and the devil, you know, fighting over, you know, Moses' body being fought over by the devil, and Michael, which is really an odd statement. Those of you who have read Reversing Hermon know that I've commented on this before, but we'll get into it here on the podcast. But again, this is a good place to end and transition to Michael and Satan in this dispute over Moses' body, because it also has to do with the blaspheming or fearing to blaspheme the glorious ones. Okay? So next time we'll hit that.
All right, Mike. Yeah, it seems like we've covered this subject today a few times on the podcast throughout the years.
We do get the question, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm really looking forward to next week's episode when you cover Michael and the devil fighting and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty weird.
Yeah, absolutely. We like weird. All right. Don't forget, go visit our sponsor, logos.com/nakedbible. If you have not done so, now's the time to go get the #1 best Bible software in the planet. And all right, Mike, well, we look forward to part 5. And with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.